The evening sun cast a golden hue over the bustling streets of Lagos, its rays bouncing off the worn-out pavements and the gleaming windshields of slow-moving cars. The air was thick with the scent of roasted corn and suya, mingling with the honks of impatient drivers and the chatter of street vendors. Adaora Nwosu maneuvered through the crowd, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. It had been a long day at work, another endless battle of corporate politics at the advertising firm where she worked. She sighed, adjusting the strap of her leather handbag as she approached the familiar intersection near Oberland. And then she saw him. The beggar sat at his usual spot, just beside a dilapidated newspaper stand. He was always there, dressed in the same worn-out kaftan, his head slightly bowed as he held out a small metal cup for alms. Unlike the other beggars who called out to passers-by, this one remained silent. Adaora had noticed him for weeks now, and there was something about him that intrigued her. He didn't fit the usual image of a beggar. His posture was too straight, his hands too clean, and his eyes, when they occasionally flickered upward, held an intensity that didn't belong to a man beaten by the streets. Still he was there begging. And that was all that mattered. Digging into her purse, she pulled out a few naira notes and bent slightly to place them in his cup. "Here you go," she said with a gentle smile. For the first time, the beggar looked at her directly. His deep brown eyes held hers for a fleeting moment before he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice smooth, almost too refined. Adaora hesitated. Most beggars she had encountered had a raspy, worn-out tone, but his was different. She brushed the thought aside and turned to leave, the city swallowing her into its chaotic rhythm. She had no idea that this single act of kindness would change her life forever. The next evening, Adaora found herself stopping at the same intersection. It had become routine now. Every day after work she would pause, reach into her bag and drop some money into the beggar's cup. This time as she placed the bills in, she noticed something odd. The cup was almost empty. She frowned. Lagos beggars, especially those in a prime location like this, usually collected a substantial amount by evening. So why was his cup nearly bare? "You don't get much?" she found herself asking. The beggar tilted his head slightly, as if surprised she had spoken to him beyond the usual pleasantries. "Not everyone gives," he replied simply. That wasn't true. She had seen many people passing him, some dropping coins, others handing him small food items. Yet every time she saw his cup, it was almost empty. She studied him again. His face was shadowed by the dimming sunlight, but she could make out sharp features, high cheekbones, a strong jawline, and the hint of a well-groomed beard beneath the scruff. His kaftan was faded but not tattered. His nails, oddly enough, were clean. Something wasn't adding up. "I hope things get better for you," she said eventually, stepping back. The beggar gave a small, almost knowing smile. "They will." As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just another beggar on the street. And she was right. Days turned into weeks, and without realizing it, Adaora had developed a routine. Every evening, after navigating through Lagos traffic, she would stop at the beggar's spot, drop some money, and sometimes exchange a few words with him. Each time his response was polite but brief. One day, as she placed some naira notes into his cup, she hesitated and asked, "What's your name?" For a moment he was silent. Then he said, "CJ." She found that odd. Most beggars used local names, but CJ sounded different. "CJ?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, just CJ." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The more Adaora stopped by, the more she noticed little things about CJ. He never stretched out his hands to beg. His clothes, though worn, were always clean. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were careful and measured. One evening she decided to test him. Instead of giving money, she brought food, jollof rice and fried plantain. When she handed it to him, he hesitated before accepting it. "You don't have to," he said. "I know. But I want to." For the first time CJ smiled. And it was a smile that stirred something deep within her. Outside her interactions with CJ, Adaora had her own battles to fight. At Phoenix advertising firm, she was seen as hardworking but too soft. Senior colleagues dismissed her ideas, male colleagues undermined her efforts. But Adaora was no pushover. One day she caught a senior colleague taking credit for her work. Instead of staying silent, she confronted him in a meeting. The entire office went silent. "If you want to use my research, at least have the courtesy to acknowledge it," she said, voice calm but firm. The senior laughed it off, but later that day her boss, Mr. Chukwuma, called her in. "You've got fire in you, Adaora," he said. "But fire can burn if you're not careful." She left his office, feeling both proud and frustrated. Life in Lagos wasn't easy, but she was determined to make something of herself. And somehow, her daily conversations with CJ were becoming the one thing that made her days lighter. While Adaora saw him as a beggar, CJ was something more. His real name was Chijioke Okafor, one of the richest men in Nigeria. A billionaire CEO of Okafor Industries. But CJ had a problem. He didn't trust anyone. Women only wanted his money. He had never experienced genuine love, friends only stuck around because of his wealth. Everyone had a hidden agenda. So he devised a test. For 6 months he would live as a beggar to see if true kindness still existed and to see if he could find true love. And then he met Adaora. Her kindness wasn't forced. She didn't give for attention. She didn't even know who he was. And that intrigued him. More than that, it scared him. CJ's best friend, Tund, thought the whole idea was ridiculous. "So you're telling me," Tund said, staring at CJ in disbelief, "that you're living here on the streets to find a woman who isn't after your money?" CJ smirked. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Tund sighed. "You have too much time on your hands." But deep down he understood. CJ had been betrayed too many times. If Adaora was different, it would change everything. One evening as Adaora was walking home, the sky darkened and rain poured heavily. She saw CJ sitting under a shed, shivering. Without thinking, she took out her umbrella and handed it to him. "Take it. You need it more than I do." CJ stared at her, speechless. No one had ever given him anything without expecting something in return. "Why do you always help me?" he finally asked. Adaora shrugged. "Because I can." And that was the moment CJ knew she was different. One night, a man in a designer suit walked past CJ, then stopped and whispered, "Hoga, what are you doing here?" CJ froze. It was one of his company's security guards. "Mind your business," CJ muttered. But Adaora had seen the interaction from across the street. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Who was this beggar really? As weeks passed, the bond between Adaora and CJ grew. She found herself looking forward to seeing him every evening. And CJ? He found himself wishing he could tell her the truth. But if he did, would she still look at him the same way? It was a Friday evening when Adaora made an impulsive decision. Instead of simply dropping money into CJ's cup, she smiled and said, "Would you like to grab a cup of coffee?" CJ hesitated. No one had ever invited him anywhere as a beggar. "You don't have to," she added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "I just thought you might need a warm drink." CJ studied her for a moment. She had no hidden agenda, just pure kindness. "All right," he said finally. They walked to a small roadside cafe. As they sat, Adaora noticed something again. CJ had the mannerisms of someone educated. He didn't fumble with the menu, he used proper English and his voice carried authority. Who was this man? Later that night, CJ met with Tund at a private lounge in Victoria Island. He had taken a photograph of Adaora with his cell's phone unknown to her while she made payment at the counter in the cafe. "She asked you to coffee?" Tund asked, amused. "That's a first." CJ smirked. "She's different, Tund. I think she actually cares. I think I have met the person I am looking for." Tund leaned back, sipping his drink. "There's only one way to find out. Let's test her." CJ frowned. "What do you mean?" Tund grinned. "Let's invite her to an event. A high-class party. I will dress in a flashy suit and make advances towards her at the party. Let's see if she will choose me over you. If she does, then she is fake, and if she doesn't, then she is genuinely in love with you." CJ wasn't sure if he liked the idea, but he agreed. The next day, Adaora was surprised when an expensive-looking envelope was delivered to her office. Inside was an invitation to the Okafor Industries Gala, one of Lagos' most exclusive business events. She frowned. Why would she be invited to such an event? The sender's name was unknown. On the night of the event, Adaora wore a simple but elegant black gown. As she stepped into the grand ballroom of the Eco Hotel, she felt out of place among Lagos elite. Across the room, Tund observed her. Dressed in a fitted tuxedo, he appeared remarkably handsome, possessing an allure that no woman could resist. He approached her and offered her a glass of wine. "Adaora," he called, presenting the glass. She turned to face him. "Hello," she managed to reply. "I know you are surprised to see me. I did in fact invite you to this party." "And who are you?" she inquired, her tone icy. "I am a follower who has been observing you closely for some time. I obtained your address through your social media profiles and sent you the invitation." Adaora was taken aback. Her curiosity about him was piqued. "I genuinely admire you, Ada, and I wish for you to be my partner," Tund stated directly. And what leads you to believe that a random stranger would invite me to a party, ask me out on the same day, and that I would acquiesce? She challenged. Tund smiled sheepishly. If you don't mind, may I take this call? He reached out to his pocket for his expensive iPhone. He stylishly displayed his luxurious Rolex watch, and elevated his leg to showcase his costly shoes. Aotearoa noticed these ostentatious displays and concluded that he was attempting to win her over with his wealth, assuming she was like other women who might fall for such superficiality. So you invited me here to propose that I become your partner? She asked as he ended his call. I am not like those women who are easily swayed by flashy displays. I am different, and my answer is no. I will not be your partner, sir. With that, she seized her purse and exited the party hall in a flurry. Tund remained, sipping his wine as he watched her depart. The following day she met with CJ and recounted the entire story about how she made it to the party and the scenario at the party. CJ had been informed by Tund the previous night about how the plan had unfolded, and he was relieved that she had rejected Tund. This confirmed to him that she was genuine, and he had already fallen deeply in love with her. He felt it necessary to reveal the truth, so he disclosed everything, including his true identity and the plan devised with his friend Tund. CJ. Her heart pounded. Was this a joke? Aotearoa was unable to contain her shock. CJ. Aotearoa's heart clenched. Had she been played? She didn't wait for an explanation. She turned and left. CJ ran after her, catching up on the busy street. Aotearoa, wait. She spun around, anger and hurt flashing in her eyes. CJ sighed. Let me explain. Please. You lied to me, she accused. You're not a beggar. You're a billionaire, CJ. What was all that for? Was it a game? CJ shook his head. No. I needed to find true love. I also needed to know if there were still good people in the world. People who cared about others, not money. Aotearoa stared at him, disgusted. So I was part of your little experiment? CJ opened his mouth but couldn't find the right words. Aotearoa scoffed. You know what? Keep your money. Keep your test. I want nothing to do with you. She walked away, leaving CJ standing there watching her go. For the first time in his life he realized he had made a terrible mistake. The next morning, Aotearoa woke up to her phone buzzing non-stop. She opened her social media and froze. #billionaire beggar was trending. News had leaked about CJ's secret life as a disguised beggar. Everyone had an opinion. Some praised him for wanting to experience life on the streets, but most criticized him. Some rumored that he lost everything due to a bad company policy and that rendered him a street beggar. Aotearoa's name was also being dragged into the mess. People speculated that she was his lover, or that she had been used and dumped. Her reputation was on the line. And she blamed CJ for it. The media had a field day. Talk shows debated CJ's actions. Activists condemned him. Even beggars on the street were divided. Some thought he was mocking their struggles, while others said he was one of the only rich men who truly tried to understand poverty. CJ remained silent, watching the chaos unfold. But his only real concern? Aotearoa. CJ finally decided to look for her. One day he trailed her down on her way from work to her apartment. He knocked after she had opened the door and went in, but there was no answer. He knocked again. After a long pause, the door opened. Aotearoa stood there, arms crossed. You have some nerve coming here. CJ sighed. I just want to apologize. For what exactly? She snapped. For lying? For making me look like a fool? Or for ruining my name in front of the whole country? CJ ran a hand through his hair. I never meant to hurt you. Aotearoa laughed bitterly. Well, congratulations. You did. She slammed the door in his face. CJ stood there for a long time before walking away. For the first time in his life he didn't know how to fix something. The next day, Aotearoa sat in a small market stall with Mama Nkechi, an elderly woman she often spoke to. After venting about CJ, Mama Nkechi sighed and said, Child, you are angry and you have every right to be. But ask yourself, was his kindness real? Or was it just his disguise? Aotearoa frowned. Mama Nkechi smiled knowingly. Sometimes men do foolish things to find the truth. But don't let anger blind you to what your heart already knows. Aotearoa ignored CJ's calls deliberately. She threw herself into work and shut her ears at him completely. 2 months later, her kind heart made her begin a fundraising to help some vulnerable beggars on the street. She took food and clothing to beggars and sometimes even to internally displaced homes. CJ, on the other hand, disappeared from public view. But in secret he was funding her charity anonymously. One evening at a fundraiser, Aotearoa noticed a familiar silhouette in the crowd. CJ. He wasn't wearing a tux. Or expensive clothes. Just simple attire. And for the first time she saw not the billionaire, not the beggar, but the man. CJ walked up to her nervous. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm here because I believe in what you're doing. Adeora stared at him. Are you expecting me to just forget everything? CJ shook his head. No. I just want to prove that I've changed. For the first time, Adeora didn't walk away. CJ vowed to live a simple life for 1 year. No wealth, no luxury, just to prove his love. And Adeora? She watched, waiting to see if this time his actions were real. 1 year later, on a quiet evening, CJ knelt before Adeora with a ring. This time no lies. Just love. Will you marry me? Adeora didn't say yes immediately. I need time, she told him. CJ understood. He had lied. He had hurt her. And love wasn't something he could buy. So, he followed through on his vow. He gave up his billionaire lifestyle for 1 full year and started working with Adeora's charity. For the first time, CJ experienced real struggles. He lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment in Yaba. He worked as a volunteer distributing food to real beggars. He learned how difficult life was without wealth. And Adeora? She watched, silently, waiting to see if this change was real. One evening, CJ sat under a bridge with some of the beggars he used to sit beside. They laughed at him. Oga, so you want to taste real suffering? CJ smiled. I just want to understand. For the first time he saw how the system was rigged against the poor. Even when they tried to get jobs, employers looked down on them. No one wanted to rent houses to them. Some of them resorted to begging by the roadside because they had no other choice. CJ had money in the bank, but he refused to touch it. He yearned to experience reality. Adeora had expected CJ to give up within weeks. But he didn't. He walked under the sun. He worked long hours. And the most surprising thing? He never complained. For the first time, Adeora saw the real man beneath the wealth. One evening, a fire broke out in one of the homeless shelters Adeora's charity supported. CJ and Adeora rushed there. But inside the burning building, a little girl was trapped. Before Adeora could stop him, CJ ran in. The fire was fierce, the smoke thick. CJ pushed forward, ignoring the heat, until he found the girl curled in a corner, coughing. I've got you, he whispered, lifting her into his arms. He staggered out of the building just as part of the roof collapsed behind him. Adeora ran to him, tears in her eyes. At that moment she knew, this was no longer a show money. CJ had proven to be real. CJ suffered minor burns. Adeora stayed by his bedside. Why would you do something so reckless? She asked, eyes shining with emotion. CJ smiled weakly. Because I couldn't watch someone suffer and do nothing. She squeezed his hand. For the first time in months she looked at him with love. 6 months later, CJ had completed his vow. He had lived as an ordinary man. He had learned. He had changed. One quiet evening, under the same bridge where they first met, CJ knelt before Adeora again. This time no disguises. No lies. Just me. Will you marry me? Adeora took a deep breath. Then finally she smiled. Yes. When news of their engagement broke, Lagos exploded with gossip. That girl caught a billionaire? After all that walla? Not real love be this oh. But Adeora and CJ didn't care. Instead of a lavish society wedding, they had a simple ceremony at a charity center. The guests? The people who truly mattered, street vendors, charity workers, and the beggars CJ once sat with. Adjusting to married life wasn't easy. Adeora still struggled with the fact that CJ had hidden so much from her. And CJ? He wasn't used to answering to someone. They fought. They disagreed. But they never stopped choosing each other. CJ's mother, Madame Okafor, was furious. You married a nobody? A commoner. CJ smiled. She's not common, Mama. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me. But Madame Okafor wasn't convinced. She was determined to break them apart. Madame Okafor gave Adeora a blank check. Take this money and leave my son. Adeora smiled and gently pushed the check back. Your money means nothing to me. For the first time, Madame Okafor was speechless. Despite their love, CJ and Adeora faced challenges. CJ struggled to balance business with their growing charity. Adeora felt neglected. You fought so hard to win me, she told him. But I don't want to be just another thing on your to-do list. CJ realized he needs to change again. He had to learn how to be a husband. He began setting boundaries with work. He took Adeora on simple dates, beach walks, night drives, umla joints in Surulere. For the first time, Adeora saw that money wasn't controlling their love. One morning, Adaora woke CJ up with unexpected news. I'm pregnant. CJ stared at her, then pulled her into a deep hug. We're going to be parents? Yes. Tears filled CJ's eyes. His heart was finally full. 9 months later, Adaora gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Chijioke Jr. Looking at his son, CJ made a vow. I will teach you that true wealth isn't in money, but in love. CJ and Adaora expanded their charity, creating shelters for the homeless. They also launched a big advert firm at the heart of the city, making Adaora a CEO. CJ balanced his billionaire business with his charity work. Together they changed lives. Madame Okafor fell sick. She called Adaora to her hospital bed. You refused my money, she said weakly. But you gave me something greater, loyalty. You are the daughter I never knew I needed. Tears filled Adaora's eyes. Madame Okafor finally accepted her. CJ and Adaora became one of Lagos' most admired couples. Their love survived every test: wealth, betrayal, and even family pressure. They raised their son to value kindness over riches. Years later, CJ sat at his desk when an old security guard entered. Oga, do you remember me? I was the one who saw you on the street years ago, dressed as a beggar. CJ smiled. Yes. And now you're the head of security here. The man chuckled. Life is funny, sir. CJ nodded. Yes. But it always rewards those who choose love over everything else. As he looked out the window watching Adaora play with their son, he knew he had found what he was looking for. Not money. Not status. But true love.